Story of Ancient Canaan and its Kingdoms. Part 1: Canaan before the Kingdoms, Bronze Age Cities and the Age of Judges. In the quiet cradle between the great river of Egypt and the twin rivers of Mesopotamia lies a narrow corridor of hills and valleys. Tonight, we begin our gentle journey through time in this ancient land, letting the calm of the ages wash over us. This land bridge, connecting three continents, would witness one of humanity's most profound spiritual transformations. The Egyptians knew it as Retinue, the Mesopotamians as Amuru, but history would remember it by the name its own people gave it, Canaan, the land of the purple-dyed traders who once sailed the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean. Its very geography seems designed for convergence and conflict, yet under the blanket of stars it rests in eternal stillness, inviting us to explore its story in peace. Coastal plains stretch along the Mediterranean shore, fertile and inviting to both settlers and invaders alike. Further inland, limestone hills rise in parallel ridges, their slopes terraced with ancient olive groves and vineyards. A deep rift valley carries the life-giving Jordan River from the sparkling Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea's bitter waters. Mountain peaks thrust skyward, Mount Hermon in the north, crowned with year-round snow, and the central highlands where Jerusalem would one day crown a ridge. To the south lies the wilderness of the Negev, stretching toward Sinai's ancient mysteries. Picture these landscapes in your mind's eye: the snow-tipped mountains and sun-baked deserts, the green hills and flowing river. As you imagine this panorama, allow yourself to breathe slowly and deeply, feeling the expanse of this land and the serenity it holds for us in this moment. This crossroads location was both a blessing and a curse. For thousands of years, armies marched through Canaan's valleys as empires rose and fell, and merchants led caravans laden with goods along the coastal highway linking Africa and Asia. Cultural influences flowed through the land like tributaries into a great river, creating a rich tapestry of languages, ideas, and traditions. In this small land, complexity bloomed, giving Canaan an outsized role in human history. And yet, beneath the clamor of ancient conflict, the land itself remained tranquil in our imagination, its hills and valleys waiting quietly through the ages. Long before any Hebrew shepherds wandered these hills, Canaan was home to sophisticated urban civilizations. In the early Bronze Age, the first true cities rose from what had been simple villages. Massive walls of mud, brick and stone encircled these cities, some over 10 meters thick, testifying to the organizing power of those early inhabitants. At Jericho, one of the world's oldest cities, walls were built to enclose nearly 10 acres, sheltering perhaps 3,000 souls within its protective embrace. We can imagine the quiet nights in ancient Jericho, families gathered behind those sturdy walls, oil lamps flickering as desert winds brushed the palm trees, a moment of calm amidst a growing civilization. These early Canaanite cities developed complex societies with artisans and traders, nobles, and farmers all contributing to the community. Copper tools gradually replaced stone, and potters shaped clay into elegant vessels on fast-spinning wheels. Metalworkers discovered how to blend copper with tin to cast bronze tools and weapons, revolutionizing agriculture and warfare. With each innovation, life changed a little, fields were plowed more easily, harvests reaped more efficiently, defenses strengthened, yet through all this progress, the rhythms of day and night continued, the stars still turning above, just as they do for us now. The wealth flowing through Canaan's cities drew attention from distant powers. Perhaps the most impressive of these early centers was Hazor in the north. At its height, Hazor spread over 200 acres and may have housed as many as 20,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities of the ancient world. Hazor excavations. Org. Hazor sat at a vital crossroads for trade. Anyone traveling between Mesopotamia and Egypt passed by, as did merchants from Anatolia and the Mediterranean coasts. By day, its markets would have bustled with traders speaking many tongues, but now, in our mind's nighttime journey, we envision Hazor at rest, its sprawling lower city and fortified upper citadel lying silent under moonlight, earthen ramparts guarding sleeping citizens. Further along the trade routes lay Megiddo, another strategic city commanding the junction where the coastal road met the valley leading into the interior. Megiddo's rulers could survey and control the traffic of caravans and armies alike. Archaeologists digging at Megiddo find layer upon layer of settlements, each built upon the ruins of the last, a continuous occupation across millennia, like pages in a book of history. Jerusalem, though a smaller town in the Bronze Age, occupied a defensible hilltop with steep valleys on three sides and a reliable spring for water. That high ridge, quietly watching over the surrounding hills, held an allure that would persist through time. Even in these early days, by day Jerusalem's inhabitants looked out from their heights over the Judean hills, and by night they gazed at the same constellations we see now, perhaps wondering what the future would bring. Canaan's spiritual landscape was as complex as its geography. The people worshipped a pantheon of fertility deities who governed the natural cycles on which life depended. Foremost was Baal, who they believed rode the clouds and brought the rain, the precious winter storms that watered their fields. His consort Asherah embodied the nurturing earth, the mother who received the rain and made the crops grow. Another goddess, Astarte, Ishtar, represented human fertility and the vitality of life. On hilltops and high places, under the open sky, priests and priestesses performed rituals to ensure harmony between the people and the divine forces of nature. Seasonal festivals marked the planting and the harvest. In springtime, communities may have gathered in sacred groves or on mountain terraces, celebrating the renewal of life with song, dance, and offerings. Some practices were striking. At a few sites, archaeologists have found evidence that children were offered in sacrifice, an extreme and apparently rare act, seen as the ultimate gift to appease the gods who held the power of life and death. We speak of these things softly, remembering that they come from a distant, harsher world. In this gentle retelling, even such dark practices are but flickering shadows, reminding us how far removed we are, safe and calm, simply listening in the present. As the second millennium BC dawned, the political wind shifted over Canaan. Egypt, under its new kingdom pharaohs, expanded its empire northward. By around 1500 BC, Canaan had become a prized frontier of the Egyptian realm, serving as a buffer against rivals from Mesopotamia and a source of tribute and trade. Egyptian garrisons dotted the land, and local Canaanite rulers became vassals who sent annual tribute of silver, gold, fine oils, wine, and other riches to the pharaoh's treasury. One can imagine the caravans of tribute wending their way south, donkeys laden with sacks of grain and jars of oil, Canaanite emissaries traveling under the hot sun to bring gifts to the distant Nile. Yet even under imperial control, the cities of Canaan did not know peace. The Tel El-Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets from the 14th century BC, give us a glimpse into this turbulent time. They are written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of that era, by Canaanite princes urgently appealing to their Egyptian overlords for help. In one famous set of letters, Abdi-Heber, the ruler of Jerusalem, writes repeatedly to Pharaoh Akhenaten, pleading for aid. He describes how enemies surround his city and warns the pharaoh, "All the lands are at peace, but I am at war." En. Wikipedia. Org. En. Wikipedia. Org. May the king send archers, he begs, or the king will have no lands left. En. Wikipedia. Org. In these letters, Abdi-Heber reports that rival Canaanite warlords and bands of lawless raiders, the Habiru, are seizing cities and cutting into Egypt's sphere of influence. En. Wikipedia. Org. En. Wikipedia. Org. We hear echoes of panic and desperation in his voice across the ages. Consider Jerusalem, he implores. This city was not given to me by my father or mother, but by the king. Yet now the sons of Labayu have taken the land of the king for themselves, and the Lapiru are encroaching. En. Wikipedia. Org. En. Wikipedia. Org. The pharaoh, far away and preoccupied, sent only limited help. And so Abdi Heber's letters, like those of many other local rulers, paint a picture of Canaan as a patchwork of city-states rife with rivalry and unrest. Each small king or mayor controlled his walled town and a handful of surrounding villages, competing fiercely with his neighbors for territory and favor. The Amarna correspondence reveals shifting alliances, territorial disputes, and betrayals at every turn. Yet despite the turmoil, if we listen closely, we might imagine the soft sounds of a Jerusalem night in 1350 BC, the distant roar of a lion in the hills, the rustle of palm fronds in the evening breeze, while a worried king sits by a flickering oil lamp, dictating another plea to the pharaoh that he hopes will bring salvation. One intriguing reference in the Amarna letters is the mention of people called the Habiru, or Apiru, bands of rootless warriors and laborers who roamed the margins of society. Scholars still debate the connection, if any, between these Habiru and the later Hebrews of biblical tradition. The tablets depict them as outsiders, uprooted groups living by their wits and strength in a world dominated by city dwellers. We can picture these groups moving camp by night, fires glowing on a distant hillside as they rest under the open sky, free from the bonds of any city. Perhaps among them were the seeds of a new people that would later arise in Canaan's highlands. By around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age system that had connected Egypt, Canaan, and Mesopotamia was faltering. Egypt's grip on Canaan grew weaker. Fewer letters were sent, fewer answers came. Pharaoh Merneptah, son of the famous Rameses II, campaigned in Canaan around 1208 BC and left behind a fascinating boast carved in stone, the Merneptah Stele. Amid a list of defeated cities and peoples, it declares, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is not." Biblical Archaeology. Org. This brief line is the earliest known mention of Israel in any ancient record. Biblical Archaeology. Org. Not as a kingdom or land, but as a people, likely a tribal federation, living in Canaan's hills around 1200 BC. The boast was premature. Clearly, the people of Israel were not wiped out, but it tells us that a group calling themselves Israelites had emerged in the central highlands by that time. Imagine, in that moment, those highland villages completely unaware that a far-off Egyptian monument was carving their name into history. They were tending flocks, storing grain, and telling their own stories by firelight, while an empire briefly took notice of their existence. Soon after, the civilized world of the Bronze Age collapsed with stunning rapidity. Within a span of decades around 1200 to 1150 BC, great powers fell and cities burned across the Near East. The causes of this upheaval are still discussed and debated by historians. Climate shifts might have brought drought and famine, driving peoples to desperate moves. Internal rebellions and civil wars could have weakened the old kingdoms. And from the outside came mysterious invaders remembered as the Sea Peoples, seafaring and land-roving groups who attacked along the Mediterranean coasts. Egyptian records describe these Sea Peoples as a confederation of different tribes, arriving in waves by land and sea, with names like the Pele-Set, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Shiaden. They brought their families with them in ox-drawn carts and in strange ships with bird-headed prows. It seems these were entire populations on the move, perhaps refugees of war or hunger, seeking new homelands. One of these Sea Peoples groups, known later as the Philistines, settled on the southern coast of Canaan. Around 1175 BC, Pharaoh Rameses III claimed a victory over them, after which the Philistines established themselves in 5 key cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These Philistine city-states, each ruled by its own lord, became the new powers of the coastal plains. They introduced new cultural elements to the region. Archaeologists find pottery in Philistine sites with styles reminiscent of Mycenaean Greek ceramics, suggesting the Philistines had Aegean origins. They built neatly planned towns with houses and temples that reflected designs from across the sea. Most significantly, they were masters of iron metallurgy, ushering in the Iron Age in this region. Unlike bronze, which relied on importing rare tin, iron ore could be found in Canaan's hills and worked by local smiths. Stronger iron plows broke the soil more effectively, and iron swords and spears gave their armies an edge over bronze-equipped foes. The arrival of the Philistines permanently changed Canaan's demographic and political landscape. With their well-armed warriors and new technology, they dominated the coastal plains and pressed inland. Later biblical tradition would remember the Philistines as the chief adversary of the Israelites, and indeed at this time they posed an existential threat to the highland communities struggling to form their own identity. Yet even the Philistines, for all their might, slept under the same sky. We might imagine a night in the Philistine city of Ashdod or Gath around 1100 BC, the glow of hearth fires inside sturdy houses, the ringing sound of a blacksmith's hammer cooling as work ends for the day, and the distant crash of waves on the shore, a rare moment of tranquility in a bustling new society. While the old Canaanite cities were falling or shrinking, new populations were settling in the previously sparse central hill country of Canaan. Archaeological surveys show that around the 12th and 11th centuries BC, the early Iron Age, hundreds of small villages sprang up in the highlands of what later would be Israel's territory. What began as scattered farmsteads grew into hamlets and then larger villages housing hundreds of people. These settlements shared common features that mark them as a distinct culture, separate from both the old lowland Canaanites and the coastal Philistines. Scholars often identify these highland villages as the early Israelites, though at this stage they were not yet a unified nation. One hallmark of their villages was a characteristic style of house, the four-room house. These were simple but efficient homes, typically rectangular, divided into three parallel sections by low stone pillars, with a fourth room spanning the back. Families lived in one area, kept livestock or storage in another, cooked and worked in the open central courtyard. This layout was practical for a life of mixed farming and herding, where people and their animals shared close quarters. Another frequent find in these sites are large storage jars with a distinctive collar-shaped rim, useful for storing grain, oil, and water, and easy to tie a cloth over the wide mouth. These collar-rimmed jars appear almost everywhere in the early highland settlements, suggesting these scattered communities had shared household practices and interacted through trade or kinship ties. Perhaps most striking, when archaeologists sift through the ancient garbage heaps of these villages, they find no pig bones. Unlike the Canaanite and Philistine towns, where remains of pigs indicate pork was regularly eaten, the highland sites show an avoidance of pork. This cultural taboo on eating pigs would later become a well-known trait of the Israelites, and later Jews, hinting that these Iron Age Highlanders shared a common identity or set of beliefs even at this early stage. It is a silent clue from prehistory. As we picture a Highland family having their simple evening meal, we know from these traces that it never included roast pork. Instead, they dined on bread, lentils, olive oil, maybe a little goat cheese or mutton, modest fare that sustained them through lean times. The Highland villages were cleverly adapted to their environment. They clustered near water sources like springs or wells, or collected rainwater in rock-cut cisterns. They terraced the hillsides to create flat plots for planting, which helped catch the rains and prevent soil erosion. On these terraces they grew wheat and barley for bread, and tended olive trees and grapevines which thrived in the Mediterranean climate. Olives provided oil for cooking and lamplight, grapes made wine that was safer to drink than water in many cases. In the narrow valleys and gentler slopes they sowed grain fields. By combining farming with herding goats and sheep on the rugged slopes, these communities achieved a resilient mixed economy. As population grew through the 12th and 11th centuries BC, some villages even built stone walls or watchtowers, suggesting they had to organize for defense against raids. Life in these hill settlements was simple and tough, but it was not without its comforts. On a mild evening, an Israelite family might sit in their courtyard under the stars, the scent of wood smoke and baking bread in the air, sharing stories while children doze in their parents' laps, scenes of domestic peace that persisted even in uncertain times. Politically and socially, these highland people lived decentralized, clan-based lives. Extended families formed the core of each village, and a council of elders or family heads would make decisions by consensus or according to custom. There was no king among them, no bureaucracies or standing army. Instead, they had tribes, loose groupings of related clans that could unite in times of need. Leadership was informal and charismatic. In crises, a brave and persuasive individual might rally the tribes to fight off a threat or resolve a dispute. Later generations remembered this era as the time of the judges. The biblical book of Judges tells of figures like Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, not kings, but deliverers raised up in emergencies. Their stories follow a recurring pattern: the people fall into dispute or neglect their deity, then enemies oppress them, the people cry out for help, a leader, judge, arises, saves them, and a period of peace follows, until the cycle repeats. How much these legends reflect literal history is hard to say, but archaeology does hint at conflicts. For example, one of the oldest Hebrew poems, the Song of Deborah, celebrates a coalition of tribes defeating the forces of a Canaanite king with iron chariots, traditionally placed at Mount Tabor in the north. Interestingly, archaeologists have found a layer of destruction at Hazor, a city mentioned in Deborah's story, around this time, suggesting some violent upheaval occurred that might echo the events later told in song. Gideon's tale speaks of camel-riding Midianite raiders from the desert who would swoop in and plunder the harvests, a scenario very plausible in the power vacuum after the Egyptian withdrawal. Gideon's clever night attack, using torches and trumpets to sow panic, is legendary. We can imagine on a dark night, hundreds of years ago, the sudden blaze of torchlight surrounding an enemy camp and the blare of ram's horn startling awake the raiders, who fled in terror at this psychological trick. Samson, perhaps the most famous judge, is remembered for his prodigious strength and his battles against the Philistines on the southern frontier. His exploits, tying fiery torches to foxes in the Philistines' fields, slaying enemies with an animal's jawbone, and ultimately toppling a Philistine temple in a final act of strength, blend folklore and metaphor. They paint a picture of the persistent skirmishes along the border between the Israelite hill country and the Philistine plains. These stories, passed down orally around countless campfires before being written, show us how people understood their world, as a struggle between the humble highland folk and the mighty city dwellers of the plains. Yet even Samson's story, full of conflict, often unfolds at a human scale, a lone man, blinded and chained, finding the strength to bring down oppression. In our gentle retelling, we focus not on the violence, but on the yearning for freedom and the hope that flickered even in dark times. The system of judges, though it allowed the tribes to survive, had clear limitations. Because there was no central authority to compel cooperation, everything depended on voluntary alliance and the charisma of temporary leaders. Success required persuasive leadership, shared threats, and common values to unite the independent tribes. When a judge passed from the scene, the tribes often drifted apart again. We can sense the fragility of that society, one year united, the next divided, depending on personalities and circumstances. As external pressures mounted in the late 11th century BC, many Highlanders began to feel that this loose tribal confederation was no longer enough to ensure their safety and prosperity. Warfare remained endemic in their world. The Philistines, armed with iron and organized in permanent armies, kept pushing into the hills. To the north, the remaining Canaanite city-states and new Aramean tribes contested the fertile valleys. Nomadic groups from the deserts raided when opportunity arose. Even rival Israelite tribes sometimes quarreled over land and water. In this unsettled environment, calls for a stronger, more centralized leadership grew louder. The younger generation of warriors, tired of perpetual insecurity, began to ask, what if we had a king? What if, instead of reacting to each crisis anew, we had a standing army and a unified command? Only a permanent king could rally all tribes and resources to face the constant threats. Before we move forward, let's take a moment to consider daily life in those highland villages during the Judge period, as this way of life was the foundation upon which the coming kingdoms would build. Houses were clustered around central courtyards where families gathered for meals and work. The aroma of baking bread often filled the air. Women ground grain into flour using stone querns every morning and kneaded dough to bake in dome-shaped clay ovens. They also wove textiles on upright looms, their children playing at their feet on the earth floor. Men spent their days in the terraced fields or tending flocks, and would return by dusk with the goats or oxen, the sound of animals settling into stalls for the night mixing with evening prayers. Children learned by watching their parents, boys following their fathers to the pasture or the threshing floor, learning to wield a hoe or sling, girls helping their mothers fetch water from the spring and grind wheat, humming old songs as they worked. Life was rhythmic and communal. During harvest or building projects, neighbors helped one another, knowing that cooperation was key to survival. Technology was slowly improving even in these remote hills. The spread of iron tools from the Philistines and other sources dramatically boosted productivity. Stronger iron plow tips could cut through tough, rocky soil that bronze or wooden plows struggled with. Iron axes allowed quicker clearing of forests for new fields, and iron sickles sped up the reaping of grain. Though at first the Highlanders had to obtain iron implements through trade or by scavenging battlefield debris, since the Philistines tried to maintain a monopoly on iron making, gradually local smiths learned the craft. By the time of the first kings, Israelite villages would have their own blacksmiths forging farming tools and weapons, breaking the Philistine stranglehold on iron. The pottery of this era in the Highlands tends to be plain and sturdy, functional ware for everyday use. There were cooking pots, storage jars, simple oil lamps, and bowls for eating. Unlike the elaborate painted ceramics of the coastal cities, Highland pottery was mostly undecorated, reflecting a culture that valued utility over display. In their relative isolation, these communities were not cut off from the world. Trade routes still wound through the hills, and evidence of luxury items has been found, a piece of ivory here, a cylinder seal from Mesopotamia there, or a bead of Mediterranean coral or a seashell from the Red Sea. Such items hint that even these upland farmers had occasional access to the broader networks of commerce, likely through traveling merchants or during visits to lowland markets. A rare adornment or imported trinket might have been cherished in a household, passed down for generations, carrying with it a whispered tale of far-off places. Religious life in the Highlands was an evolving tapestry. The villagers worshipped the god of their ancestors, who later would be known as Yahweh, but at this early stage many probably still used the name El, the high god, or other titles. They built simple altars of uncut stone for sacrifices and poured out drink offerings on bare rock surfaces. At the same time, they participated in some of the broader Canaanite religious culture. They had small clay figurines, perhaps of mother goddesses for household devotion, and they joined regional festivals where neighboring peoples honored Baal or Asherah. Notably, what they lacked were grand temples or images of their main god. Already, something was different in the Highland faith, a simpler, imageless worship that would later develop into a core tenet of Israelite religion, the aniconic tradition. But in these early days, religious syncretism, mixing, was common. This mix of devotions would later be seen as a source of spiritual tension, but for now it was simply part of life. A traveler passing through a hill village might see a rough stone altar under an oak tree and nearby a couple of figurines of Astarte or Asherah in a home, and think nothing of it, just as the people themselves likely felt they were covering all bases by honoring the one who brought them out of Egypt, according to emerging tradition, as well as the local deities of rain and fertility. Under the quiet night sky, a highland family might bow their heads to an unseen god and also whisper a blessing for the earth goddess to keep their fields fertile, blending old and new in the gentle silence. Warfare cast its shadow on all aspects of life. In the debris of highland sites we start to find more weapons like arrowheads and sling stones, and some villages constructed defensive walls and hidden silos to guard against raids. This suggests a militarized environment. People had to be ready to grab their spears at a moment's notice if watchmen sighted an enemy column in the distance. The greatest external threat came from the Philistines, who by the 11th century BC had expanded beyond the coast into the foothills, aiming to penetrate the highlands and control the region fully. The Philistines had more centralized organization and could deploy larger forces with iron weaponry and even chariots in certain areas. They established garrisons in key valleys, like the Valley of Elah and others, effectively cutting off communication between different highland groups. They demanded tribute from surrounding villages and enforced a ban on blacksmiths in Israelite territory, to keep the highlanders dependent and disarmed, as remembered in the biblical verse, "Now there was no smith to be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears." In those days, a farmer might have to go down to a Philistine town just to sharpen his plow or axe, paying dearly for the service. Throughout the 11th century BC, border warfare intensified. The Book of Judges ends with a picture of internal disorder. Every man did what was right in his own eyes, an external menace. Fortified outposts like Beth-Shemesh alternated between Israelite and Philistine control. Raiding parties and counter-raids swept across the land, sometimes leaving burned villages and smashed storehouses in their wake. Excavations at various sites have uncovered burn layers and destruction debris from this era, confirming that the struggle was very real. Yet, as often happens in hardship, heroes emerged from this crucible of conflict. Their deeds, magnified in memory, were passed down in songs and stories that eventually formed the early portions of Israel's scriptures. These leaders combined military skill with what the people saw as divine favor, a potent mix that could inspire others to follow. They proved that the highland communities could fight and win when united, but also highlighted how temporary such victories were without lasting unity. By the late 11th century BC, the situation had reached a breaking point. The pressure from the Philistines was ever escalating, while the decentralized tribal structure was increasingly ineffective at organizing a sustained defense. The old arrangement of temporary judges and tribal coalition seemed inadequate for the challenges at hand. Many among the Israelites began to clamor for a change, for a permanent leader who could marshal all tribes, a king who would go out before them and fight their battles. This transition toward monarchy was a momentous step, both a continuity and a break with the past. On one hand, it grew naturally out of the existing kinship system. A king would ideally be someone from among them, perhaps of a respected lineage, who could still honor tribal identities. On the other hand, a monarchy meant concentrating authority in one person and creating new institutions above and beyond the tribe, something that had never been done in Israel before. The people's relationship with their deity would also be reinterpreted. They began to articulate the idea of a covenant, a special pact with God that could provide a framework for kingship under divine law. In this view, the king must not be absolute like pagan kings who claim to be gods. Rather, Israel's king should be subject to the covenant, guided, and sometimes rebuked, by prophets who spoke for God. This was a new concept in the ancient Near East. Even the king is under higher law. Military necessity was the immediate driver of this political evolution. To resist the Philistines and other foes, the tribes needed a standing army and fortifications that required centralized coordination and resources. One can think of those highland youth who had grown up during the worst of the fighting. Perhaps they looked at the disciplined Philistine ranks and said, "We need someone to lead us like that, a single commander." Economic changes also nudged them towards statehood. The agricultural expansion in the hills meant there was surplus produce that could support specialists, soldiers, administrators, court officials. Trade was picking up again after the Bronze Age collapse, and to engage in diplomacy and commerce, a more unified representation was useful. As the 12th century BC turned into the 11th, the Israelite highlands stood poised at a historic crossroads. Behind them lay centuries of gradual adaptation, the quiet heroism of everyday survival, the formation of a distinct culture and faith amid adversity. Ahead of them lay the radical experiment of kingship, which promised to bring strength and stability but also threatened to change their way of life forever. The step from a loose confederation of tribes to a centralized kingdom was as momentous as it sounds. It would solve some problems but create new ones. Innovation vs. tradition, royal command versus tribal freedom, these tensions would play out over generations to come. Yet the foundations for monarchy had been laid. The population was now large enough and united enough by culture and belief to envision a nation. There was a growing sense of shared identity and destiny among the tribes. After all, they had weathered the storms of the Bronze Age collapse and survived the onslaughts of powerful neighbors. They possessed the demographic strength, cultural cohesion, and military potential needed for statehood. The external Philistine threat provided the catalyst that made the status quo untenable. All that was needed was a charismatic leader to seize the moment, rally the tribes under a common banner, and establish the institutions of kingship. In other words, the time was ripe for a king. And so, with the dawn of the Iron Age, the age of the judges was drawing to a close, and the age of kings was about to begin. Let us pause here for a moment, at this turning point in the story. In the stillness of our narrative night, take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of the centuries that have passed, centuries of struggle and faith, of simple joys and great sorrows, and allow that weight to gently dissipate with your exhale. The people of Canaan have journeyed long in darkness and twilight, and now a new day is hinting at the horizon. As you relax deeper, imagine the first light of dawn peeking over the hilltops of Ephraim and Judah, heralding a new era. When you are ready, we will continue, ever so softly, into the next chapter of this ancient tale, United Under One Crown. Part 2, United Under One Crown, the Kingdom of Israel, Saul, David, Solomon. The transformation from a loose tribal confederation to a centralized monarchy began quietly, born not of grand ceremony but of urgent necessity. In the late 11th century BC, the highland tribes of Israel faced a threat that could no longer be met by ad hoc alliances and temporary judges. Coastal invaders, the Philistines, had pushed deep into the central hill country, establishing garrisons and seizing key routes. One by one, the scattered settlements that had flourished in the era of the judges found themselves overmatched by a relentless, organized enemy. The old system of occasional charismatic leaders rallying volunteers could no longer protect the land against this sustained pressure. Something had to change, or the highland tribes and their way of life would be extinguished. Amid this crisis rose the figure of Samuel, often regarded as the last and greatest of the judges. Samuel was not only a wise leader but also a priest and prophet, a bridge between the old order and the new. Initially, Samuel resisted the people's clamor for a king. He feared, and rightly so, that establishing a human monarchy would fundamentally alter the unique relationship between the Israelites and their God. In the old days, the Lord alone was their king, guiding them through prophets and judges. A human king would introduce new dynamics, taxes, forced labor, a royal court, possibly tyranny. Samuel warned the elders about these dangers. A king, he said, would take your sons for his army and your daughters for his service. He would take the best of your fields and flocks. In the hush of the night, we can almost hear Samuel's stern yet sorrowful voice echoing in the assembly of elders, as they contemplate the momentous decision before them. But even Samuel recognized that Israel's survival was at stake. The Philistines controlled iron-making and had forged superior weapons. They fielded well-trained armies that could overpower any single tribe's militia. The grim reality was that without a unified defense, the Israelites would be picked off piece by piece. And so Samuel, guided by divine insight, finally agreed to anoint a king, albeit with a heavy heart. The man chosen was Saul son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was an impressive figure, tall and handsome, standing head and shoulders above others. He had a commanding presence that people naturally followed, the kind of physical charisma ancient peoples expected in a leader who would face their enemies in battle. His tribal origin was also carefully chosen. Benjamin lay between the northern and southern tribes, a small tribe that posed no threat of dominance, making Saul an acceptable compromise candidate for all Israel. The circumstances of Saul's emergence were humble and almost serendipitous. As the biblical account relates, he was out searching for lost donkeys when he met Samuel. But soon after his anointing, Saul proved his worth. When the town of Jabesh-Gilead east of the Jordan was besieged by foreign enemies, the Ammonites, in that case, Saul mustered an army from all the tribes and marched overnight to rescue the city. His victory at Jabesh-Gilead electrified the nation. Here, at last, was someone who could unite disparate clans into a single fighting force and win. Not long after, Saul won an even more crucial battle at Michmash against the Philistines, breaking their control over the central hill country, as recounted in 1 Samuel 14. This victory demonstrated that with coordinated strategy and leadership, the Israelites could defeat the Philistine garrisons that had terrorized them. Imagine the jubilation that swept through the highland villages when news came that Saul's army had routed the Philistines. For the first time in living memory, the people felt a surge of hope and newfound confidence. No longer were they merely surviving raids, now they were driving the invaders back. The psychological impact of Saul's early successes was immense. Elders who had been skeptical of kingship had to admit that under Saul's command, unity had brought strength. The hill people, who for generations had only managed to endure foreign incursions, saw that they could actually prevail when united. A line had been crossed, there was no going back to the old disorganized ways. Under the gentle stars, around communal fires, families gave thanks that their sons had returned victorious and that their homes were safe, at least for a time. Breathe softly here, feeling that relief and pride that must have filled those ancient nights, a calm reassurance after long anxiety. Yet, founding a monarchy involved far more than winning battles. Saul now faced the daunting task of creating governmental institutions to support a permanent kingdom. Until now, the tribes had been autonomous, everything was handled locally by family heads. Now taxes needed to be levied to pay for a standing army, officials had to be appointed to organize supplies and enforce the king's commands, and a rudimentary court had to form around Saul's person. Saul established a royal camp, and later a capital at Gibeah in Benjamin, and gathered warriors not just when war loomed, but as ongoing professional soldiers. This was a radical change for people used to volunteering for short campaigns and then returning to their farms. Some likely grumbled at supporting fighters year-round, perhaps muttering as they gave a portion of their harvest to royal collectors for the first time. The transition was difficult for a population accustomed to local autonomy and consensus decision-making. We can picture an Israelite farmer around Saul's time. He might remember how his father was free from any overlord, and now he sees his own son conscripted into Saul's forces or laboring on a fortification project. It was a trade-off, some freedoms for greater security, and not everyone was happy with it. Religious tensions also accompanied the rise of kingship. Samuel had warned of this as well. In Israel's old system, spiritual authority was separate from political authority. The priests and prophets dealt with religious matters and offered sacrifices, while judges might lead in battle but always deferred to God's law. Now Saul, in the flush of power, sometimes overstepped those bounds. On one occasion, Anxious before an impending battle and unable to wait for Samuel, Saul himself performed the burnt offering, a ritual that by tradition only priestly figures like Samuel should do. This act, meant to seek God's favor, ended up angering Samuel and many devout Israelites. It symbolized a new tension between royal prerogative and religious tradition. Under the stars of those days, there were likely hushed conversations among the elders. Our king is strong, yes, but will he remain humble before the Lord? Or will he become like the pagan kings, who think themselves above the gods? This uneasy question would echo throughout Israel's history. As time went on, King Saul struggled with increasing pressures and his own inner turmoil. The initial euphoria of unification gave way to the challenges of ruling fractious tribes and fighting relentless wars. Saul's psyche began to fray under the strain. The Bible describes episodes of melancholy and paranoia. He grew suspicious of anyone who might challenge his rule. Most tragically, he turned against his loyal young commander David, who had become a hero in his own right. Saul's jealousy and fear of David drove him to irrational pursuits, hunting David across the wilderness while the real enemy, the Philistines, regrouped. We can imagine Saul in his dark tent on a restless night, the oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the walls as he broods over prophecies that the kingdom would slip from his family. Outside, the night is calm, but within Saul's heart a storm raged, one that not even the soothing harp music David once played could now calm. Saul's reign reached a tragic end on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines had massed for a major offensive, and Saul went out to face them in one last desperate battle. The Israelites were routed. Saul's 3 sons, including his beloved Jonathan, were cut down, and Saul himself, wounded and surrounded, fell on his own sword to avoid capture, effectively committing suicide on the battlefield. The news of this catastrophe sent a shudder through the land. Many must have thought the nascent kingdom had died with Saul. Once again, Philistine forces moved in, occupying parts of the north and even putting Saul's royal town to the torch. In a single day, Israel had lost its king and army. The experiment in centralized government seemed to have failed utterly, ending in blood and tragedy. And yet, even in that dark moment, seeds of renewal remained. Saul's reign, though short and tumultuous, had established important precedents. The tribes had seen that they could act as one. They had experienced the benefits of professional military leadership, and the idea of divinely sanctioned monarchy had taken root in their minds. No matter how disastrously Saul's rule ended, the people's imagination had been kindled. They now expected that a king could lead them to victory and secure the land, if only they had the right king. It was as if the first attempt at a house had collapsed, but the foundation was still there, ready for building anew. That new building began with David. As Saul's kingdom fell apart, David was waiting in the wings. David's rise to power is a tale of resilience and destiny. A generation younger than Saul, he started as an unassuming shepherd boy from Bethlehem, a talented harpist who first came to Saul's court to soothe the king's troubled spirit. He became famous after facing the Philistine giant Goliath in single combat, a youthful hero with only a sling and unshakable faith, defeating a fearsome enemy that had paralyzed Saul's army. This victory made David a folk hero across Israel's tribes. The people sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands," much to Saul's chagrin. David served Saul loyally as a commander and had a deep friendship with Prince Jonathan, Saul's son. But as Saul's mind darkened with paranoia, David was forced to flee for his life, becoming an outlaw despite his innocence. In his years on the run, David gathered a band of followers, a motley crew of discontented men, debtors, and fugitives who found in David a leader worth following. He lived in the wilderness, moving from hideout to hideout, even taking refuge for a time among the Philistines to escape Saul's pursuit. These wilderness years honed David's leadership and built his reputation as a merciful and just figure. He famously spared Saul's life twice when he had the chance to kill him, proving he had no ill intent. By the time Saul died at Gilboa, David was ready. However, the road to David's kingship over all Israel was not smooth. After Saul's death, the tribe of Judah, David's own tribe, immediately accepted David as their king, and he set up his rule in Hebron in the south. But the northern tribes were hesitant. They crowned Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, as king in the north, under the influence of Saul's general Abner. Thus, a civil war ensued between the house of Saul and the followers of David. It was a tragic conflict, fratricidal fighting that lasted perhaps 2 years, with skirmishes and shifting loyalties. Abner and David eventually negotiated peace, but then Abner was murdered by David's general Joab in a revenge feud. Not long after, Ishbosheth himself was assassinated by his own captains. The biblical account describes David as reacting with grief and executing the assassins, signaling that he did not desire his rivals' murders. With the northern leadership gone, the elders of Israel finally turned to David and anointed him king over all 12 tribes, completing what Saul had begun, the unification of Israel under one monarch. David proved to be a shrewd and visionary king. One of his first decisions addressed a delicate issue, the need for a neutral capital that could bind the north and south together. He set his sights on Jerusalem, a fortress city held by the Jebusites, a Canaanite people, that stood on the border between Judah, to the south, and the northern tribes' territory. Jerusalem had not belonged to any one tribe of Israel up to that point, so choosing it would not be seen as favoritism. Moreover, Jerusalem's position was militarily advantageous, a hill city with strong defenses and its own reliable water supply from the Gihon spring. According to tradition, David's forces captured Jerusalem through a clever tactic, by sneaking in through a water shaft or tunnel, catching the Jebusite defenders by surprise. The city, thought to be nearly impregnable, fell to David, and he declared it his new capital and royal city. Establishing Jerusalem as the capital was a masterstroke. David did not attach it to his tribe Judah, instead, he made it a personal possession of the crown, a place where all tribes could come together without rivalry. He brought his administration there and began expanding the city, building a palace for himself and quarters for his officials. For the first time since the days of Hazor or Megiddo in the Bronze Age, a single city controlled the central highlands from north to south. The phrase "from Dan to Beersheba" came into being to describe the span of David's realm, Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the south, with Jerusalem roughly in the middle. David organized a centralized government, taxes were collected from all Israel to support the standing army and court, trade was regulated, and justice was administered by royal judges beyond just tribal customs. One can imagine the transformation in daily life. Villagers who once dealt only with local clan elders now might see a royal official arriving on horseback with orders from the king, or a messenger reading out a decree in the city gate. Change was in the air, but under David's charismatic and unifying presence, it was largely welcomed as the dawn of a stronger era. In uniting the nation, David also understood the power of spiritual unity. To solidify the bond among the tribes and between the people and their God, David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark, an ancient chest sacred to the Israelites, was believed to house the presence of God. It had been carried during the Exodus and housed in various shrines during the Judges period. By bringing the Ark into his new capital, David signaled that Jerusalem was not just the political heart but now the spiritual center of Israel. The biblical account describes David dancing with joy before the Ark as it entered the city, wearing a linen ephod, a priestly garment, in a rare moment where a king humbly assumes a servant's posture to honor God. It was a powerful image of pious leadership, the king himself celebrating like a common worshipper, indicating that even the monarch submits to the divine King of Israel. Under David's leadership, Israel finally found the security and prosperity it had long yearned for. David was a brilliant military leader. He continued to win victories against Israel's neighbors. The Philistines were decisively subdued to the point where they were no longer a mortal threat, and Israel's borders were pushed outward. He conquered Moab to the east, fought Aramean, Syrian kingdoms to the north, and established vassalage over Ammon and other states. By the end of David's reign, Israel controlled a small empire from the Euphrates border in the north to the Red Sea Gulf in the south, bringing wealth and tribute into the kingdom. Trade flourished, with caravans moving through Israelite territory under the protection of David's troops. We might picture a marketplace in Jerusalem during David's time, traders from Phoenician ports selling fine linens and dyes, Arabs from the desert with spices, Egyptians perhaps with papyrus and gold, all plying their wares under the shadow of David's growing city. There is a pleasant hum of commerce and the mingling of tongues, a far cry from the days when fear kept people hiding in hillside terraces. Allow yourself to drift in this scene for a moment, an open-air market on a sunny afternoon, the air rich with the scent of olive oil and cedar wood, the laughter of children darting between stalls. It's a scene of peace and plenty that David's hard-won victories made possible. David's reign was not without troubles, personal and political. His later years were marred by family strife and rebellions, the tragedy of Absalom, his son, for example, but overall, David left a legacy as Israel's beloved poet-warrior king. He was remembered as a man after God's own heart, who united the nation, defended it, and set up the structures that would endure. Many of the Psalms, the beautiful hymns of the Bible, are attributed to David, reflecting a soul that experienced the heights of joy and depths of despair and turned them into prayers. In our relaxed exploration, we can almost hear the distant strains of David's harp on a quiet night atop the walls of Jerusalem, as he composes a psalm of gratitude. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside still waters, he restores my soul. Such words, whether from David's own hand or written in his honor, have comforted countless generations, including perhaps our own hearts as we listen now, centuries later, letting the gentle music of ancient faith lull us. When David died after a 40-year reign, the throne passed to his son Solomon around 970 BC. Solomon inherited a strong, united kingdom with established borders, a centralized administration, and a treasury enriched by tribute. However, Solomon's challenges were of a different nature than his father's. He did not need to fight for survival or unity, those battles had been won. Instead, Solomon's task was to govern wisely and lead the nation to further prosperity. And indeed, Solomon's reign is remembered as an era of unprecedented peace and grandeur. Free from the constant wars that had characterized earlier times, Solomon could focus on development, trade, and cultural achievements. He forged alliances, most notably with Hiram, the king of Tyre, a Phoenician city-state. Through this partnership, skilled craftsmen and materials like the famed cedars of Lebanon were imported for Solomon's ambitious building projects. The friendship with Tyre also meant Israel took part in the lucrative maritime trade of the Phoenicians, sending ships down the Red Sea and perhaps even into the Indian Ocean. Solomon is famed above all for building the temple in Jerusalem, a permanent house of worship to Israel's God. David had dreamed of it, but the task fell to Solomon, who employed tens of thousands of laborers and artisans over 7 years to construct a splendid temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. Imagine the sight during construction, great limestone blocks being cut and moved into place with rollers and ropes, cedar beams being fitted for the roof, the sound of hammers and chisels by day. But by night, the site would fall silent under the moon, and one might walk among the unfinished walls sensing the sacred purpose to which this house would be dedicated. When the temple was completed, the Ark of the Covenant was placed inside its inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and the nation celebrated with sacrifices and songs. It's said that at the dedication, Solomon prayed and a cloud of glory filled the temple, the sign of divine presence. For the Israelites, this moment was deeply comforting. It symbolized that God's dwelling was now in their midst in a fixed place. They need not wonder or fear, for the Lord had a house among them. Solomon's wisdom became legendary. The Bible recounts the famous story of two women who came to him with a dispute over a baby, and Solomon revealed the true mother by suggesting the child be divided, knowing the real mother would rather give up her child than see it harmed. Whether mythic or historical, such stories conveyed Solomon's reputation for shrewd and compassionate judgment. Kings and queens from distant lands, such as the Queen of Sheba from Arabia, were said to visit Solomon to test his wisdom and behold the prosperity of his realm. They brought caravans of spices, gold, and precious stones as gifts, and departed in awe of his wealth and insight. Under Solomon, Jerusalem grew into a cosmopolitan city. The royal palace complex was expanded, including the famous House of the Forest of Lebanon, an immense hall named for its many cedar pillars. There were lavish banquets and international guests. It's a picture of an early golden age. We might envision strolling through Solomon's palace gardens at twilight, imported peacocks call softly, lilies and pomegranates bloom around reflecting pools, and learned scribes discuss philosophy under a vine-draped trellis as incense wafts in the breeze. The air is warm and fragrant, and the hard memories of wars and wandering seem to fade in this oasis of enlightenment and luxury. However, prosperity had its price. To support his grand projects and sophisticated state, Solomon imposed heavy taxes and forced labor on his people. He divided the kingdom into administrative districts, sometimes overriding tribal boundaries, to efficiently gather resources. Each district had to provide food for the king's household 1 month of the year, and laborers were conscripted for building works and mining. Over time, these burdens grew. Solomon also took many foreign wives, sealing alliances with surrounding nations, Pharaoh's daughter of Egypt, princesses of Moab, Ammon, Sidon, etc. These wives brought their own gods and idols, and to please them, Solomon built shrines for their deities on the hills around Jerusalem. This introduction of foreign cults sowed seeds of religious discontent among the faithful. So, even as Israel glittered under Solomon's reign, fault lines began to form beneath the surface. The northern tribes in particular felt the weight of Solomon's centralized policies. They provided a disproportionate share of labor for Solomon's building programs, including the temple and the palace. They saw the fruits of their labor adorning the capital, while their own villages remained poor. In our meditative journey, we pause and sense a subtle tension, like distant thunder on an otherwise clear evening. There is a hint that this peace may not last forever. Solomon reigned for about 40 years. When he died, around 930 BC, he left a mixed legacy, a glorious kingdom, but one strained by heavy demands and internal divisions. Still, at the moment of his passing, few could have predicted how quickly things would unravel. The empire of David and Solomon was the stuff of dreams for those who lived through the chaotic times before. One can imagine old men in far-flung villages telling their grandchildren by the fireside, "In King David's time I was a young soldier, in King Solomon's time I saw the temple in all its glory." Truly, we were blessed. Those golden memories would shine in contrast to what followed. As we close this chapter on the United Monarchy, let's take time to absorb its arc, from Saul's brave beginnings and tragic end, to David's passionate unification and conquests, to Solomon's wise rule and magnificent building. So much was achieved, yet so much human fragility persisted. This is a lesson gently whispered by history. Even at our heights, we are never free of imperfections. Now, take a deep, calming breath and let these images settle. See in your mind the city of David at dusk, the temple on the hill catching the last rays of the sun, as priests light the evening lamps. Hear the distant strains of a psalm being sung, the city quieting into nightfall. The people sleep secure under one crown, for the last time all together. Before moving on, allow yourself to simply rest in this moment of unity and peace in our story. Feel the sense of wholeness and completion that Solomon's era embodies, a nation at rest, each man under his vine and fig tree, as the Bible says of that prosperous time. As you exhale, release any tension, and as you inhale, draw in the tranquil spirit of ancient Jerusalem's nights. In the next part of our journey, we'll see how this unity doesn't last, how human pride and discontent cause a fracture. But for now, in this pause, all is calm, all is bright in the kingdom of Israel. Part 3, The Divided Kingdoms, Israel and Judah part ways. Solomon's passing marked the end of an era, and the dawn of a schism. The grandeur of a united Israel under David and Solomon would soon become a wistful memory. As Solomon's son Rehoboam ascended the throne in Jerusalem, the cracks in the kingdom's foundation widened into a fracture. The narrative of how the kingdom divided in two is both historical and deeply human, a tale of harsh policies, wounded pride, and the age-old struggle between north and south, center and periphery. Rehoboam traveled to the northern city of Shechem for his coronation, as was custom, a wise gesture, perhaps, to show respect to the northern tribes on their own soil. Representatives of the tribes gathered there with a clear message for their new king. Under Solomon, they said, life had become burdensome, your father made our yoke heavy, they pleaded. Now therefore, lighten the hard service and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. In essence, they asked Rehoboam for relief, lower taxes, less forced labor, in exchange for their continued loyalty. It was a reasonable request from people who had borne the brunt of the kingdom's prosperity. At this pivotal moment, Rehoboam sought counsel. The elders who had served Solomon urged moderation and compassion. They advised Rehoboam that if he would be a servant to the people for a day, speaking kindly and easing their load, those people would be his servants forever. But Rehoboam also consulted his young peers, those who had grown up in the luxury of Solomon's court. These younger advisers scoffed at the idea of showing weakness. They urged the new king to assert his authority without compromise. Following their swaggering tone, Rehoboam delivered a fateful reply to the assembly at Shechem, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." It was a stunningly harsh response, a complete misreading of the people's mood. Instead of empathy, he answered with braggadocio, instead of conciliation, with threat. The effect was like a lightning bolt. Decades of pent-up frustration in the north ignited. The northern tribes refused Rehoboam's authority on the spot. They proclaimed, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel!" By invoking David's lineage, son of Jesse, they made clear their rejection of the southern dynasty. It was a ritual formula for rebellion. Rehoboam, stunned and angered, sent his labor foreman to quell the uprising, perhaps thinking to force them back to work as Solomon might have. But the official was stoned to death by the angry populace. This was no mere protest, it was outright revolution. King Rehoboam barely escaped back to Jerusalem, and the once united kingdom fell into two pieces with startling swiftness. Thus, around 930 BC, the kingdom of Israel split. The 10 northern tribes formed their own kingdom, keeping the name Israel, also known as Ephraim or Samaria later, under the leadership of Jeroboam, a former official who had led labor forces under Solomon and had voiced grievances before fleeing to Egypt. Jeroboam returned from exile to seize this opportunity and was acclaimed king by the northern tribes. In the south, only the tribes of Judah and Little Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming the smaller kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. The once mighty unified monarchy was now two rival states, brothers turned adversaries. This division was not merely political, it ran along deep cultural and economic lines. The north, Kingdom of Israel, was larger in population and richer agriculturally. Its valleys, Jezreel, Jordan, were fertile breadbaskets, and its position along major trade routes brought more cosmopolitan influences. The north had been where much of Solomon's building energy was directed, like the palaces in Megiddo and Hazor, and the industrial cities, and foreign influences were more strongly felt in daily life. They perhaps felt less bound to the unique religious importance of Jerusalem, having other shrines like Dan and Bethel in their territory. The south, Kingdom of Judah, was more sparsely populated, centered on the highlands around Jerusalem, and relatively isolated. The land of Judah had more wilderness and marginal land, with only a few pockets of good agriculture. But it had Jerusalem and the Temple, the singular religious focus of the Old Kingdom, and the Davidic royal family with its covenant promises. The split kingdoms quickly established separate identities. Jeroboam, ruling from Shechem and later Tirzah, and eventually Samaria under later kings, had the enormous challenge of setting up a new government and cult for Israel. He had to wean his people off pilgrimage to Jerusalem, lest their hearts return to Rehoboam's rule. So Jeroboam established alternative worship centers at Bethel in the south of his realm and Dan in the far north. At each, he set up a golden bull calf statue as a symbol of the God of Israel, likely intending it as a throne for God, but many saw it as idolatry. This move was controversial and would later be harshly condemned by Judean writers, but Jeroboam likely felt it necessary to solidify his kingdom's religious independence. Meanwhile, Rehoboam fortified cities in Judah and Benjamin, preparing for war to reclaim the north. A full civil war was only averted, according to the biblical account, by the intervention of a prophet who told Rehoboam that this division was God's doing and to not fight his brothers. So Rehoboam desisted, for the moment. Instead, the two kingdoms settled into an uneasy coexistence punctuated by periodic wars and skirmishes over the next 2 centuries. Politically, both kingdoms faced new realities. Smaller and isolated, Judah had to be crafty to survive. Israel, larger but more exposed on the international stage, had to navigate threats from powerful neighbors like Aram Damascus to the north and later the rising Assyrian Empire. Economically, the north's fertile lands gave it an advantage. In the early years, Israel likely prospered more than Judah. Archaeological remains show impressive ivory inlaid furniture and luxurious houses appearing in Samaria, Israel's later capital, during the 9th century BC, indicating wealth. Judah remained more rustic for longer, its fortunes concentrated in Jerusalem's royal court and the temple. The human dimension of the split is poignant. Families were divided by the new border. Levites and devout followers of Yahweh who were unhappy with Jeroboam's religious changes migrated south to Judah, strengthening its religious identity. Conversely, some northerners who disliked David's line were pleased to have their own rule. Trade between the two areas likely suffered at first. One can imagine traders at border outposts grumbling that where once they traveled freely with their goods from Dan to Beersheba, now there were checkpoints and suspicion. The Bible preserves the heartache of the division in a story. When Rehoboam assembled 180,000 warriors to fight Israel, the word came, "You shall not go up or fight against your relatives. Return every man to his home, for this thing is from me." 1 Kings 12 verse 24. It underscores that this was a fraternal rupture, brothers fighting brothers, a very painful ordeal for a people who once marched together around Jericho's walls and sang the Lord's songs in unison. In our reflective journey, we feel that sadness, like a cool wind in the night after a day of strife, a reminder that even in calm narration, sorrowful events have their weight on the heart. Thus the twin kingdoms of Israel, north, and Judah, south, embarked on separate trajectories, forever linked by shared history and faith, yet often bitterly at odds. Each will have its own story, its series of kings, its challenges, its prophets calling the nation back to higher ideals. For a time, Israel will outshine Judah in power and wealth. But ultimately, Israel's fall will be more sudden and complete, while little Judah will linger longer, sustained perhaps by that one great temple on Mount Zion and the flickering hope in a promise made to David. For now, let us step back and consider the early days of the divided kingdoms. Imagine standing on a hill in Benjamin, near the new border, on a quiet evening. To the north, you see the lights of an Israelite town, perhaps Bethel, where people gather at Jeroboam's new altar. To the south, only a few miles away, the hills lead toward Jerusalem, where the glow of the temple lamps shines, and Levites sing the ancient songs of David. The same twilight and the same stars envelop both kingdoms. Ordinary farmers in Israel and Judah alike guide their animals into pens and sit down to their humble meals. They both tell their children the old stories of Abraham, of Moses, and the Exodus, of Joshua's victories, for all those stories are from before the division, part of a common heritage. But by day, their kings plot against each other, and their roads diverge. Allow yourself to feel the irony. By night these two lands are one in quietude and memory, by day they are rent by politics and pride. How often in human history have we seen such divides, and how often have the common people on either side longed for the simpler unity of before? As we breathe in this scene, we might whisper a gentle hope that time will be kind to both Israel and Judah, though we know from our vantage point that both will face great trials. Before we move on to the fate of these kingdoms, let's gently place this knowledge into our hearts: no golden age is free from human folly. The heights of Solomon's realm were followed by a humbling crash. Yet through it all, the thread of a people's story continues. They endure and adapt. In your mind's eye, watch the campfires flickering on the highlands as families in both kingdoms prepare for sleep, perhaps praying for better days. We too can drift a little more deeply now, knowing that, like those families, we carry on through life's changes. The narrative flows onward, and we float with it, calm and observant. Part 4: The Fall of Israel, Assyrian Conquest and the 10 Lost Tribes. As the years flowed on, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah settled into their separate destinies. The once united people of Canaan were now two nations, sometimes cooperating against common foes, but often following different paths. In this part of our story, we turn our gaze to the kingdom of Israel, the larger, more populous northern state, and trace its journey to a poignant and tragic end. It is a tale of flourish and fall, of prosperity darkened by idolatry and injustice, and ultimately of destruction and dispersal at the hands of a rising empire. Yet even in this tragic arc, we will move gently, like a soft breeze turning the pages of history, mindful that real lives and hopes flickered in those distant times. After the division, the kingdom of Israel established its capital first at Shechem, then at Tiza, and finally, in the early 9th century BC, at Samaria, a newly built city on a hill that became synonymous with the northern kingdom. Under the early kings like Jeroboam and his successors, Israel experienced a mix of turmoil and stabilization. There were coups and assassinations, a pattern of unstable leadership, as different factions vied for control. But by the time of King Omri, circa 880 BC, and his son Ahab, Israel had risen to considerable power and wealth. Omri is credited with building Samaria and establishing a new dynasty that brought relative stability. Internationally, Israel under Omri and Ahab was respected. The Assyrians even referred to Israel as the land of Omri for generations, underscoring how famous that king became. Ahab, Omri's son, reigning around 874 to 853 BC, is depicted in the Bible as a villainous king, largely because of his marriage to Jezebel, a Phoenician princess, and the introduction of Phoenician Baal worship on a grand scale in Israel. Ahab built a temple to Baal in Samaria and supported Jezebel's efforts to promote her religion, which provoked fierce resistance from the prophets loyal to Yahweh, notably the great prophet Elijah. But aside from religious controversy, Ahab's reign was actually a high point in Israel's prosperity. Samaria's ivory-inlaid furnishings and Sumerian elites' luxuries likely date from this era. Militarily, Ahab was strong enough to join a coalition that halted Assyrian expansion at the Battle of Karka in 853 BC, a notable achievement for a regional king. Despite outward success, Israel struggled internally with the consequences of its religious and social policies. The prophets Elijah and his successor Elisha emerged as fiery critics of the royal house, not only for idolatry but for injustice, such as Ahab and Jezebel's infamous seizure of Naboth's vineyard, where Naboth was falsely accused and executed so the king could confiscate his land. This story epitomized the moral decay that the prophets railed against, the rich and powerful trampling the rights of ordinary Israelites, a breach of the covenant values of justice and mercy. Elijah thundered that a drought would punish the land, and later confronted the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel in a dramatic contest to show whose God was real. These stories from the Book of Kings illustrate the deepening spiritual crisis in Israel, even as the nation maintained political strength. The royal house of Omri eventually fell to a zealous army commander named Jehu, around 841 BC. Jehu's revolt, as described in 2 Kings, was bloody and thorough. He eliminated Ahab's heirs, Jezebel, and all supporters of Baal he could find, in a purge ostensibly to restore pure Yahweh worship. However, Jehu's zeal had another effect. It destabilized the kingdom and severed Israel's alliance with Phoenicia, through Jezebel, who was a Tyrian princess. Internationally, this was a risky move, and indeed Israel's fortunes waned somewhat after Jehu. The larger context now was the looming presence of Assyria, an aggressive empire from Mesopotamia that had begun campaigning westward. By the mid-8th century BC, the 750s-740s, both Israel and Judah encountered a new epoch of challenge. The Assyrian Empire under Tiglath-Pileser III, Pul, was expanding relentlessly. Assyria's policy was brutal: conquer, exact heavy tribute, and sometimes uproot entire populations to prevent rebellion, mass deportations. In those decades, Israel experienced a temporary resurgence under Jeroboam II, who reigned in the early 8th century, expanding its territory and enjoying peace while Assyria had internal distractions. Jeroboam II's reign was another golden moment. Archaeological findings suggest houses in Israel grew larger, adorned with expensive goods, indicating an upper class thriving. But soon after his death, instability returned, and a rapid turnover of kings ensued. Into this scene came the writing prophets, voices of conscience that called the nation to account. Amos, a shepherd from Judah who prophesied to Israel around 750 BC, and Hosea, a native northerner a bit later, are two whose poetic oracles survive in the Bible. Their tone is urgent and somber. Amos decried the extravagance of the wealthy and the oppression of the poor in cities like Samaria and Bethel. He thundered, "Hear this, you cows of Bashan on Samaria's mount, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy," Amos 4 verse 1, and warned of coming punishment. Amos envisioned God measuring Israel with a plumb line and finding it warped, ripe for judgment. Hosea, with a more tender yet grief-stricken voice, likened Israel to an unfaithful wife betraying her husband, God, by pursuing Baals and foreign alliances. He pled for repentance, all the while knowing that the nation's spiritual adultery and moral corruption were leading it to ruin. Hosea even named a son Lo-Ammi, meaning "not my people," as a sign that the covenant bond was fraying. These prophetic voices add a deeply human and poignant dimension to the history. They show us the inner soul of the nation, not just the external events. Imagine Hosea standing in a marketplace of Samaria, watching people pass, merchants cheating with dishonest scales, nobles strutting in fine robes while beggars starve at the gate, and at the shrine nearby, people offering incense to a mix of gods, and Hosea feels God's heartbreak and anger. He returns home perhaps at dusk and writes sorrowful verses by the light of an oil lamp, his wife and children a living allegory of the land's unfaithfulness. Through prophets' eyes, we see that for all Israel's political maneuverings, there was a higher moral narrative unfolding, one where compassion, humility, and devotion were the measures of success or failure. Now, historically, the climax for Israel came in the period 735 to 722 BC. The kings of Israel, caught between Assyria and its neighbors, tried various strategies. Sometimes they paid tribute to Assyria to buy peace, other times they rebelled and sought Egypt's help. One king, Pekah of Israel, even allied with Aram Damascus to attack Judah and force it into an anti-Assyrian coalition around 735 BC, the Syro-Ephraimite War. That attempt failed when Judah's king Ahaz instead summoned Assyrian help, which led Tiglath-Pileser III to invade and punish the northern coalition. In 732 BC, Assyria crushed Damascus and annexed a large part of northern Israel, the Galilee and Gilead regions, into its provinces. Thousands of Israelites were deported at that time from those northernmost areas, a first wave of exiles. Israel was left shrunken, basically the central hill country and Jezreel Valley. A new king, Hoshea, took the throne in Samaria. Hoshea tried to survive by paying tribute to Assyria for a while. But when Tiglath-Pileser died and Assyria seemed to waver, Hoshea made the fatal choice to rebel, looking to Egypt for support. In truth, Egypt was weak and divided, not a reliable savior. Assyria, now under King Shalmaneser V and later Sargon II, responded swiftly. They laid siege to Samaria, the capital, in 725 BC. The siege of Samaria lasted about 3 years. One can only imagine the desperation inside the city as food dwindled and disease spread. Perhaps some remembered the prophecies and realized with sinking hearts that this was the judgment foretold. In 722 BC, Samaria fell. The Assyrians executed some leaders, probably tortured others, as was their custom, and carried off a huge portion of the population, perhaps 27,000 people as Sargon's records claim, into exile in various parts of the Assyrian Empire, Mesopotamia and Media. These exiles, 10 tribes worth of people, though likely it was not all individuals, but the elite and many communities, were resettled far from home and eventually assimilated or lost to history. They are often referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, for their distinct identity faded away over generations, absorbed by other peoples. Assyria then imported colonists from other conquered lands into Samaria and the surrounding region. These peoples mixed with the remaining Israelites who had not been deported. In time, their descendants would come to be known as the Samaritans, a community with mixed blood and mixed religious traditions. They adopted worship of Yahweh but with differences, causing Jews of later times to look down on them. But that is in the future. For now, in 722 BC, we witness the end of the kingdom of Israel. It is a somber scene, the proud capital Samaria with its walls breached and smoking, Assyrian soldiers patrolling its streets. Perhaps in the ruins of the royal palace, ivory plaques that once decorated furniture lie trampled and charred. Chains of captives, men, women, and children, are led out, leaving their homeland behind, some weeping, some in stunned silence. Fields that once yielded grain and olives lie unattended, villages emptied of many inhabitants. The land has been decapitated of its leadership and a large chunk of its populace. Only a remnant remains, mostly the poorer folk, and new foreign faces appear as they settle in the abandoned homes. How did it feel, one wonders, for those Israelites taken away? Did they sing lament psalms by the rivers of Assyria, as the Judeans would later do in Babylon? Did they long for the land flowing with milk and honey that they had lost, or did the shock and harsh conditions of exile erase their traditions quickly? We have scant record of them afterwards. They vanished into the sands of history, giving rise even to legends. In later centuries, people speculated about the fate of the lost tribes, myths of them living beyond some mystical river, awaiting reunion. But in real time, what happened was likely prosaic and sad. They were resettled in small groups in far-off villages, eventually speaking Aramaic, worshipping local gods or a memory of Yahweh, and intermarrying until they were indistinguishable. For those left in the land, life had to go on under new masters. Israel as a political entity was gone, transformed into an Assyrian province called Samaria. The mix of peoples there eventually forged a new identity, the Samaritans, with a variant form of Yahwism. They would have their own version of the Pentateuch and a temple on Mount Gerizim later. But the pure northern kingdom, with its dynasty of kings and prophets and warriors, was no more. Reflecting softly, we might recall the warnings of Amos, "Therefore you will be among the first to go into exile, your feasting and lounging will end," Amos 6 verse 7. How hauntingly that came true. The banquets of Samaria's elites ended in hunger and exile. Hosea's pleas, "Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God," went unheeded, and he saw his beloved nation fall like a shattered jar. There is a deep sorrow in this, akin to a final sigh of the wind through the cedars that once adorned Ahab's palace. Yet, as we let this sad history wash over us, we maintain a gentle awareness that even in endings, there are new beginnings elsewhere. The spotlight of our story will now shift to the southern kingdom of Judah, which remained. Judah saw its sister Israel fall and surely took it as a cautionary tale, at least for a time. Imagine a Judean shepherd on a hill in 720 BC, looking north where once he could see the lights of Israelite towns and now perhaps sees darkness or foreign encampments. He murmurs a prayer, "Lord have mercy, do not let that happen to us." Judah's story was not yet finished. It would have about 135 more years of sovereignty and a very distinct journey, with its own trials and triumphs. Before moving on, let's pause to commemorate the tale of Israel's tribes. In a sense, they are not entirely lost. Their bloodlines and heritage live on, partially in the Samaritans, partially absorbed into Judah. Some refugees fled south during the collapse, and, as fate would have it, in the greater spiritual legacy of the people of Israel that eventually gave rise to Judaism and Christianity. But as a political house, the northern kingdom's lamp went out. We will keep that extinguished lamp gently in our thoughts for a moment. Its flame flickered with such promise in the days of David and Solomon's united realm. It burned independently with brilliance and shadow in the days of Omri and Ahab, and then it dimmed and was snuffed out by the winds of empire. In this quiet moment, breathe in and recognize the impermanence of worldly glory. The lesson of Israel's fall has echoed through history, that injustice and moral decay weaken a nation's soul, that even strong walls cannot save a people who forget the foundations of mercy and truth. And yet, in the mysterious tapestry of time, nothing good is truly lost, it transforms. The songs of the north may have fallen silent in Assyrian exile, but some voices carried those songs to the south, and others preserved memories that would later be written down. Much of the Hebrew scriptures, including the stories of Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, etc., ensure that Israel's legacy endures in text if not in state. Now, as we gently close the chapter on the 10 tribes of Israel, let's direct our softened gaze to the lone kingdom that remains, Judah. The little brother that survived the Assyrian flood, standing like a single light in the darkness that enveloped the region. Its story of narrow escapes, reforms, and eventually its own downfall and hope for restoration awaits us. Take another calming breath, and when you're ready, we'll proceed to see how Judah fared in the looming shadow of empires. Part 5: Judah Alone, Reform, Resistance, and Babylon's Shadow. With the northern kingdom gone, the spotlight of history narrowed onto the southern kingdom of Judah. The year is 722 BC. Judah stands alone as the sole custodian of the legacy of David, surrounded by the rising tide of great empires. The house of David still rules in Jerusalem, and the Temple of Solomon still gleams on its hill, its sacrifices rising like prayers for protection. But the world around Judah has changed dramatically. Assyria, having devoured Israel, now turns its gaze toward all of Syria-Palestine. Judah's continued existence will depend on wise leadership, humility, and often sheer providence. In this chapter, we will follow Judah through its final century and a half as a kingdom, a tale of near-miraculous deliverance, religious revival, stubborn pride, and the gathering storm of Babylon that ultimately casts a long shadow. After Israel's fall, King Hezekiah was on the throne of Judah, reigning c. 715 to 686 BC. Hezekiah was one of Judah's great kings, remembered for both his faith and his defiance of Assyria. Perhaps jolted by witnessing Israel's demise, Hezekiah initiated sweeping religious reforms. He removed pagan altars and high places, smashed sacred pillars, and even broke the bronze serpent, Nehushtan, that Moses had made, because people had begun to worship it. Centralizing worship at the temple in Jerusalem, he sought to purify Judah's devotion to Yahweh alone. The prophet Isaiah, active in Jerusalem at this time, was a key influence. Isaiah's counsel and encouragement helped shape Hezekiah's policies. Isaiah is an imposing yet reassuring presence in Judah's story. He was of noble lineage, a visionary who walked the streets of Jerusalem preaching trust in God above all. Through all the political intrigue, Isaiah's voice rises in the scriptures: "In returning and rest you shall be saved, in quietness and in trust shall be your strength." He urged the kings not to rely on alliances with Egypt or others, but on the Lord. And he delivered messages of both judgment and hope, from condemning social injustice, woe to those who join house to house and add field to field, squeezing out the poor, he cried, to painting a future glorious restoration, speaking of a Prince of Peace and a time when a nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Under Hezekiah, Judah also prepared militarily. He fortified Jerusalem and other key cities, notably improving Jerusalem's water supply by carving the Siloam Tunnel through bedrock to secure water from the Gihon spring into the city, a brilliant engineering feat whose inscription was discovered by archaeologists. This would prove crucial in a siege. Hezekiah likely expanded the city's walls as well, anticipating trouble. Sure enough, trouble came. In 701 BC, Assyrian king Sennacherib marched west to quash rebellions, and Judah was on his list, since Hezekiah had stopped paying tribute and possibly entertained alliance with Egypt. Sennacherib's prism, an Assyrian record, boasts of devastating Judah's countryside. He claims to have destroyed 46 walled towns and countless villages, taking 200,000 plus captives, perhaps inflated, and besieging Jerusalem, with Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. Indeed, Lachish, Judah's second-largest city, was besieged and fell brutally. The famous Lachish reliefs in Nineveh depict Assyrian soldiers storming its walls, impaling prisoners, leading away captives. The psychological impact on Jerusalem must have been terrifying as refugees and news of Lachish's fate reached the capital. According to the biblical account, 2 Kings 18-19, Isaiah 36-37, Sennacherib's envoy, the Rabshakeh, stood outside Jerusalem's walls and called out in Hebrew to demoralize the defenders, "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, saying the Lord will deliver us. Has any god of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria?" He rattled off all the conquered lands. The people on the wall were silent as instructed, but surely their hearts quaked. Hezekiah, in sackcloth, went to the temple and prayed fervently, and Isaiah sent him a message of reassurance: the Assyrian would not enter the city, for the Lord would defend it for his own sake and David's sake. That very night, something remarkable happened. The Assyrian army suffered a sudden calamity. The Bible attributes it to an angel of the Lord who struck the camp, while some historians suggest possibly a plague or a mysterious epidemic. Sennacherib abruptly broke off the siege and returned home. He never took Jerusalem. Thus Jerusalem was saved, an event that became legendary, a symbol of divine protection. Sennacherib's records do not mention why he left, only that Hezekiah sent tribute later. But the deliverance was seen by Judah as a miracle. This episode emboldened the faith of many and cemented Jerusalem's status as inviolable in popular imagination, perhaps too much so, as later events would show. For now, Judah licked its wounds. The land was ravaged, but the core survived and enjoyed a measure of peace. Hezekiah's reign ended in relative prosperity. He was even healed from a deadly illness as a sign from God, with the shadow on a sundial moving backward as a wonder. Yet one misstep, he displayed all his wealth to envoys from Babylon, then a rising regional power, and Isaiah rebuked him, foretelling that one day all those treasures and his descendants would be carried to Babylon, a prophecy that would come true long after Hezekiah. Hezekiah's son Manasseh took the throne next, c. 687 to 643 BC. In stark contrast, Manasseh is remembered as a king who reversed his father's reforms and led Judah into a long period of idol worship and moral decline. He reigned for an exceptionally long time, about 55 years, and filled Jerusalem with foreign altars, even in the temple courts. He practiced sorcery, consulted spirits, and according to the account, even sacrificed his own son in fire to a pagan deity, a horrific act of apostasy. The streets of Jerusalem ran with innocent blood under Manasseh, tradition says, possibly including prophets like Isaiah. Later Jewish writings claim Manasseh executed Isaiah by sawing him in two. This era, though politically quiet, Manasseh was a loyal vassal to Assyria, likely paying tribute and staying out of trouble, was spiritually dark. It's as if Judah, having been spared annihilation, squandered its second chance and drifted far from its calling. However, late in Manasseh's life, something interesting is hinted. Assyrian records mention Manasseh as a contributor of troops and resources, implying he was under Assyria's thumb. Biblical chronicles say Manasseh was taken captive to Babylon by the Assyrians for a time and there he repented and was later restored, a story of redemption, though not in Kings. True or not, Manasseh's long reign ended, and his son Amon briefly ruled and continued in evil, but was assassinated by his servants after 2 years. In 640 BC, Josiah became king at the tender age of 8. He would be the last great reformer of Judah, and under him the nation had one final spiritual revival. As Josiah grew, he showed a heart for his ancestor David's ways. By age 20, he began purging idols and high places throughout Judah, and even in some former northern areas as Assyria's grip weakened. In his 18th year, a momentous discovery occurred. The Book of the Law, likely Deuteronomy or the core of it, was found in the temple during renovations. When it was read to Josiah, he tore his robes in despair, realizing how far Judah had strayed from the covenant. Immediately, Josiah gathered the people and held a covenant renewal ceremony, pledging to follow the Lord and enforce the law's commands. He expanded reforms, destroying altars of Baal, burning the bones of false priests on their altars, as a way to defile them, and he reinstituted the Passover in a grand way, such as had not been seen since the days of the judges or before. This Josianic reform, circa 622 BC, was probably the most fervent religious awakening in Judah's history. For a time, the nation experienced a collective spiritual renewal. The prophetic voices of that time, like Jeremiah and Zephaniah, supported the thrust of the reforms. However, one senses from Jeremiah's later laments that many people's repentance was superficial. Judah has not turned to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, God says in Jeremiah 3 verse 10. Yet during Josiah's days, things looked hopeful. It was like a fresh morning after a long night. On the international stage, Josiah's reign coincided with the decline of Assyria. The mighty empire was crumbling under internal strife and external pressure from a new enemy, Babylon, allied with the Medes. City after city of Assyria fell, and by 612 BC, Nineveh itself was sacked. Josiah likely took advantage of this power vacuum to extend his influence into the former Israelite territories, hence his reforms reaching Bethel and Samaria. For a brief moment, Judah enjoyed de facto independence, not having to answer to Assyria or anyone else. It must have felt invigorating, perhaps some even dreamed of a reunited Israel-Judah kingdom under the righteous Josiah, undoing centuries of division and foreign domination. Alas, the geostrategic reality was that another power would soon fill the void. Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho II, sought to contend for control of the region, and ultimately to help Assyria perhaps, as a balance against Babylon's rise. In 609 BC, Necho marched his army north along the coast, heading to Carchemish on the Euphrates, where the last Assyrian forces were making a stand with Egyptian support. King Josiah, perhaps out of loyalty to the ideal of Davidic rule over all the land or to perhaps fulfill prophecy, some think he might have wanted to stop Egypt from helping Assyria, believing Babylon's victory would be better for Judah's future, went out to intercept Pharaoh at Megiddo. It proved a fatal decision. Josiah was killed in battle at Megiddo by the Egyptian forces, a devastating blow to Judah. The righteous king was gone, and with him died the hopes of an enduring revival. Jeremiah and the people of Judah mourned Josiah bitterly. It's said Jeremiah composed laments for him. Indeed, one can feel the shift in Jeremiah's tone after Josiah's death. Despair creeps in, as if he knows that was Judah's last chance to avert doom. From this point, Judah's downhill slide quickened. Egypt now temporarily dominated Judah. They deposed Josiah's successor, one of his sons, after a short reign, and placed another son, Jehoiakim, on the throne as a vassal. Jehoiakim was not like his father. He was more inclined to oppression and luxury, and he reversed the reforms, allowing idolatry to creep back to appease various factions. Jeremiah clashed with Jehoiakim, warning of Babylon's approach and calling for repentance, but Jehoiakim infamously cut up and burned Jeremiah's written prophecies, showing contempt for the word of God. Meanwhile, the great clash between Babylon and Egypt played out. In 605 BC, at Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar, crown prince of Babylon, utterly defeated the Egyptian army, ending Egypt's brief ambitions in the Near East. Babylon was now the uncontested superpower of the region. Nebuchadnezzar succeeded his father as king and swept through Syria-Palestine to secure his empire. Jehoiakim of Judah became a Babylonian vassal, but after a few years, foolishly rebelled, perhaps thinking Egypt could help, or maybe he died and his son continued the rebellion. Babylon's response was swift. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem. Jehoiakim had died during the siege. Some say he was killed or died naturally, and his 18-year-old son Jehoiakim surrendered the city after 3 months on the throne. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive to Babylon, along with the royal family, the elite, and thousands of craftsmen and soldiers, about 10,000 people, including the prophet Ezekiel and likely others like Daniel, if one follows that tradition. This was the first deportation, 597 BC. The Babylonians looted the temple and palace but left them standing, and they placed Josiah's third son Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's uncle, on the throne as a puppet king. Judah was now a shadow of its former self, politically subjugated, economically drained, and missing many of its leaders. Yet, remarkably, Jerusalem still stood, the temple still held its daily sacrifices, and a remnant of the people remained. It was a time of uneasy calm under Babylon's heavy hand. The prophet Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem, urging the people to accept Babylon's rule as God's discipline and not to listen to false prophets promising a quick return of the exiles or victory. In Babylon, Ezekiel conveyed visions of the future and also urged the exiles to settle in for a long stay. Zedekiah, weak-willed and pressured by nationalist factions at court, eventually succumbed to the delusion that perhaps with new alliances, Egypt again, he could break free. Despite Jeremiah's warnings that rebellion would bring catastrophe, Zedekiah joined a regional revolt around 589 BC. This sealed Jerusalem's fate. In 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came one last time, determined to make an example of the rebellious city. Jerusalem endured a grueling siege for about 18 months. Food ran out, famine set in, people were reduced to terrible straits. Lamentations later suggest some even considered cannibalism in desperation. The city's morale crumbled. Jeremiah, still urging surrender to save lives, was seen as a traitor by officials. They jailed him in a cistern briefly. But nothing could stop the Babylonian juggernaut. In mid-586 BC, the walls of Jerusalem were breached, Zedekiah and some soldiers tried to escape at night, but were captured on the plains of Jericho. In a cruel punishment, Zedekiah's sons were executed before his eyes, and then his eyes were put out, so the last thing he ever saw was the death of his lineage. Bound in chains, he was hauled off to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's forces then carried out systematic destruction. In August 586 BC, they burned the Temple of Solomon to the ground, along with the royal palace and all the grand houses of Jerusalem. The Babylonians tore down the mighty walls of the city, leaving it defenseless and in ruins. The sacred vessels of the temple, gold and bronze implements used in worship, were taken as spoils to Babylon. What few people remained, mostly poor folk, watched in horror as the city that had stood for nearly 4 centuries as the symbol of God's presence was turned into a smoldering heap. A second large deportation followed. The Babylonians rounded up the remaining leaders, priests, warriors, and skilled workers, essentially anyone who might foment future rebellion or be useful elsewhere, and marched them to exile in Babylon. Only the poorest of the land were left behind to tend the fields and vineyards, now paying tribute to Babylon. Judah as a kingdom had effectively ceased to exist. The fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC was an earth-shattering event for the Jewish people. It prompted a profound crisis of faith and identity. The Davidic monarchy was ended, though one Davidic prince, Jehoiakim, survived in Babylonian prison, giving a glimmer of hope later. The Ark of the Covenant was likely lost or destroyed in the chaos. It's never mentioned again in the Bible after the exile. The covenant people had lost the land, the city, and the temple that they believed were guaranteed by divine promise. As one psalmist lamented, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion." The Book of Lamentations is an acrostic poem of grief, likely composed by Jeremiah or his circle, describing the desolation of the city, comparing her to a widow who once was a princess. Yet amid this darkness, the spark of faith and resilience was not fully extinguished. Jeremiah, who ended up forced into Egypt by some fleeing Jews, had prophesied that the exile would last 70 years and then God would bring back the captives. Ezekiel in Babylon had stunning visions of eventual restoration, including a new temple. Isaiah's later chapters, or a disciples, foretold that a ruler named Cyrus would allow the return. These seeds of hope would sustain the exiled community. Back in the land of Judah, now a Babylonian province called Judah, a poor remnant persisted. The Babylonians appointed Gedaliah, a Jewish noble, as governor over the few towns and fields that remained inhabited. He tried to encourage stability, urging people to serve Babylon and not rebel. But a nationalist Judean of royal blood, Ishmael, assassinated Gedaliah within the year, causing chaos and leading many of the remaining Jews to flee to Egypt for fear of Babylonian retaliation. Among those dragged to Egypt, tradition says, was the elderly prophet Jeremiah, who likely died there, still proclaiming God's word to a stubborn people. And so Judah was left virtually empty and utterly broken. The land enjoyed its Sabbaths, the chronicler would later say, meaning the land finally had rest from its inhabitants to recover, as had been warned in the law if the people were unfaithful. This could easily be the end of the story, a nation destroyed, its people scattered. Many ancient peoples conquered by empires vanished or assimilated entirely. But here is where the story of Canaan's kingdoms takes a surprising turn of preservation and renewal that we will explore in the final part. Persia will rise, exiles will return, and the legacy of Israel and Judah will find new form. For now, let us rest in the heavy twilight after Jerusalem's fall. Picture the ruins, blackened stones, collapsed roofs, wild vines starting to crawl over the heaps that were once palaces. A lonely figure, perhaps Jeremiah's scribe Baruch or some anonymous survivor, walks amid the ruins at sunset, hearing only the wind where once children played and choirs sang in the temple courts. He stoops to pick up a fragment of a scroll or a burnt cedar beam, and wonders, how did it come to this? In that stillness, one could feel a divine lament as well, as if God's heart broke with his people's suffering. O Jerusalem, who killed the prophets, how often I longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not. Take a deep breath, let the sorrow and lessons of Judah's fall settle gently. Though painful, this part of the tale is instructive. It speaks of the impermanence of even the most sacred earthly institutions when corrupted, and it sets the stage for a renewal not of kings and armies, but of hearts and hopes. Even as the smoke clears over the destroyed city, there are seeds in the ashes, the preserved scrolls, the memories, the faithful remnant, from which a new chapter will sprout. Let's gently remind ourselves in our relaxed state, endings are not always the end. Sometimes they are the necessary night before a new dawn. And indeed, a dawn would come for the children of Israel, from an unlikely source far to the east. When you feel ready, we will proceed to our final part, where we find the exiles in Babylon and witness their return and the enduring legacy of these ancient kingdoms. Part 6, Return and Remembrance, Persia, Restoration, and the Legacy of the Kingdoms. When the long night of exile had settled over Judah, few could have imagined the reversal that fortune, or rather, providence, would bring about. The Babylonians, who seemed invincible, themselves met their match. In 539 BC, nearly 50 years after Jerusalem's destruction, the winds of change blew from the east in the person of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia. In a stunning and virtually bloodless campaign, Cyrus captured Babylon, the mightiest city of its time, in a single night. Babylon's gates were opened, according to legend, by diverting the Euphrates River and marching under the walls, and the populace accepted Cyrus as a liberator. Cyrus, unlike previous conquerors, had a novel approach to empire. Instead of brutalizing and oppressing subject peoples, he practiced a policy of tolerance and restoration. He believed that contented populations would make more loyal and productive subjects. And so he famously allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands and even supported the rebuilding of their temples. The Cyrus Cylinder, an ancient clay decree, records how he returned various god statues to their sanctuaries and repatriated communities. For the Judean exiles in Babylon, this was nothing short of miraculous. In 538 BC, Cyrus issued an edict that the Jews could return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of their god. One can imagine the euphoria among the exiles when the proclamation was read out, perhaps at the very canal-side gathering places where they once hung their harps and wept. Now they rejoiced and began planning the journey home. Not all Jews went back. By now, many had been born and grown up in Babylon, and some chose to stay where life was comfortable, thus beginning the long existence of the Jewish diaspora. But a sizable group, driven by faith and longing, prepared to make the trek back across the desert to the land of their ancestors. Leading the first return was Sheshbazzar, a prince of Judah, possibly a son or descendant of Jehoiakim. Soon after, more groups followed under Zerubbabel, another Davidic scion, and Joshua the high priest. The book of Ezra records these events. The journey home was one of joy tempered by the daunting reality they found. Arriving in Judah around 536 BC, the returnees saw a land largely desolate and a city in ruins, no walls, charred rubble where the temple had stood. Wild animals roamed where children once played. It was a bittersweet homecoming. Psalm 126 later captures their feelings. When the Lord brought back the captives to Zion, we were like those who dream. Though they go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, they will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves. Despite immense challenges, shortage of resources, opposition from local peoples, Samaritans and others who had settled during the exile, and their own discouragement, the repatriated Judeans set about rebuilding. They first erected an altar on the temple's old site and resumed the daily sacrifices. There is a touching scene in Ezra where the foundation of the second temple was laid. The younger folks shouted for joy, while the old who had seen Solomon's temple wept aloud, and the sound mingled such that it was hard to distinguish joy from sorrow. How poignant, the collective memory of loss and renewal in one moment. The construction of the Second Temple wasn't smooth. Local adversaries, possibly the Samaritans, offended that they weren't included fully in the project, lobbied the Persian court and managed to halt the work for a time. But under the inspiration of prophets Haggai and Zechariah, who urged the people to take courage and finish what they started, the work resumed. Haggai chastised the Judeans for dwelling in paneled houses while God's house lay in ruins. Zechariah shared mystical visions of a purified Jerusalem and a coming messianic figure. With Persian permission renewed under King Darius, the Second Temple was completed in 515 BC, about 70 years after the first had been destroyed, fulfilling Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy in a way. It was a modest structure compared to Solomon's grandeur, but it was consecrated with great joy. God's worship was restored in the land. The high priest and Zerubbabel, the governor, led the community, and there was hope that maybe a new age was dawning. Some even thought Zerubbabel, being of David's line, might become a messianic king. But that did not materialize, likely for political reasons with Persia. Over the next decades, more exiles trickled back. Ezra, a scribe, led a return in 458 BC and helped re-establish adherence to the law, Torah, reading it publicly and guiding a spiritual revival. Nehemiah, a Jewish cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, obtained leave to govern Judah and spearheaded the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls around 445 BC. Amid opposition and threats from some hostile neighboring elites, Nehemiah and the Jews worked with trowel in one hand and sword in the other, and in just 52 days rebuilt the city walls, securing Jerusalem once more. With walls, a temple, and increasing population, Jerusalem was truly reborn as a functioning Jewish city, albeit under Persian rule. Thus by around 400 BC, a small autonomous Jewish community was firmly re-established in Judea, centered on the rebuilt temple, an outcome that a century earlier would have seemed impossible. The legacy of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah did not end in ashes after all. It transformed. The Israelites emerged from exile calling themselves Jews from Judah, and their identity became focused more on their faith and law than on political sovereignty. They had learned, painfully, that their mission was to be faithful to their God whether or not they had a king or independence. In the centuries to follow, beyond our main scope, the Jews would pass under Greek rule and then Roman, endure hardships and revolts, and their temple would eventually be destroyed again, in 70 AD by Rome. But the spiritual ideas nurtured in ancient Canaan, ethical monotheism, covenantal community, messianic hope, would spread throughout the world, profoundly influencing Western civilization and beyond. Now, as we reflect gently on all these events, we might ask, what remains of ancient Canaan and its kingdoms? Not in a physical sense, for their palaces are dust and their kings' sepulchres are ruins, but in terms of meaning and contribution. From Canaan, the crossroads of empires, we inherited a rich amalgam of cultures. The alphabet, via Phoenicia, trade networks that linked continents, and cautionary tales of city-state rivalries. The very name Canaan faded, replaced by Palestine and other terms, but it set the stage as the land where a unique drama of faith would unfold. From the kingdom of Israel, the northern tribes, though politically lost, came prophetic voices, Amos, Hosea, Elijah, Elisha, and a tradition of challenging injustice and empty ritualism. The idea that religion demands righteousness, not just offerings, was loudly proclaimed in Israel's hills. From the kingdom of Judah, we have the enduring house of David, an ancestral line that became the seedbed for the Jewish messianic expectation, and in Christianity, Jesus is believed to fulfill that hope as a son of David. We also have the literature compiled or written during and after exile. Much of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, as we have it took shape or was canonized by the returning exiles, preserving the collective memory of all that happened from Genesis through Kings and beyond, as a national library of identity and divine revelation. The Second Temple period saw the blossoming of Judaism as a religion of the book, law, and synagogue, practices that sustained the Jewish people through millennia without a country, a testament to the spiritual resilience that was forged in the fires of exile and return. Looking back from our restful vantage, the story of ancient Canaan and its kingdoms is like a long journey through night into morning. There were brilliant dawns, the united monarchy's glory, the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah, and dark midnights, the invasions, exiles, destructions. But in each era we find threads of hope and lessons for the spirit. Perhaps the deepest lesson is voiced in the scriptures by the prophets, that empires rise and fall, but the word and purpose of the divine endure forever. A remnant will always carry the promise forward. As we conclude our meditative historical journey and vision one last scene, it is around 515 BC on a calm evening in Jerusalem. The Second Temple, newly built, stands atop Temple Mount. Its white limestone is tinged gold by the setting sun. There is singing heard, the Levites are chanting psalms of praise and thanksgiving. Among the worshippers are elderly folk who remember the first temple and young children who were born on the long road from Babylon. Together they sing, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his love endures forever." The city's walls are not yet up, but peace reigns for the moment under Persian auspices. On a nearby hill, perhaps the prophet Zechariah sits with a scroll, writing down a vision. Old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, and the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing. Zechariah 8 verses 4-5. That vision is becoming reality before his eyes. A gentle breeze rustles through the olive trees as dusk falls. The long turmoil has given way, at least for now, to restoration. Breathe in this peace, the feeling that after all the trials, something enduring and sacred was refined and carried on. The physical kingdoms of Canaan became dust, but they gave birth to ideas and faith that would outlast marble and gold. Their legacy lives in every synagogue, church, and mosque that tells the stories of Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, and the prophets. It lives in concepts of justice, peace, and the value of repentance and forgiveness. Now our story comes to an end, and as you drift deeper into relaxation or sleep, let the gentle lessons linger. Kingdoms rise and fall, but faith, hope, and love endure. Like the ancient hills of Canaan that saw it all and remain, the core truths stand firm through time. You may imagine yourself standing on those hills under a starry sky, feeling the quiet of centuries. All is calm. All is remembered. In this tranquility, you are safe, cradled by history's long arc and the resilience of the human spirit. Allow yourself to relax completely now, as the echoes of the ancient story fade into a comforting silence. The journey is complete. The story of ancient Canaan and its kingdoms has been told, a tale of wanderings and homecomings, of downfall and renewal, whispered now into the still night. Let these whispers guide you into a deep, restful sleep, knowing that dawn always follows even the darkest night, and memory keeps alive that which should never be forgotten. Good night and sweet dreams.